December. For most, it's a time of warmth, joy, and celebration. But for me, it's something else entirely. Every snowflake, every carol, every flickering light, it all reminds me of the horrors I've lived through. You see, December has a way of revealing what's hidden, what should have stayed buried. These stories, they aren't just tales I heard, they happened, and even now they haunt me, creeping back every time the calendar turns to this cursed month. If you think you know fear, think again. These are 4 disturbing true horror stories that unfolded during the season of cheer. By the end, you might never look at December the same way again. People often ask me why I hate December. They assume it's the cold, the darkness, or maybe bad memories from my childhood. But the truth is far worse. December isn't just a month to me. It's a season of shadows, a time when the line between the living and the dead thins. The stories I'm about to share aren't fiction. They're the reason I don't sleep when snow falls or lights flicker. If you think December is about joy and celebration, these 4 nights will make you think again. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I dread the sound of bells, the glow of Christmas lights, and the whisper of snow against my window. December had always been my favorite time of year, but that changed the winter I decided to spend Christmas alone. The idea of escaping the chaos of the city and hiding away in a remote mountain cabin seemed perfect, peaceful, quiet, and surrounded by snow-covered trees. I booked a cabin I found online, a charming little place tucked in the woods, far from the nearest town. The pictures looked cozy, with a roaring fireplace and cheerful Christmas lights strung along the porch. I arrived on a crisp afternoon, the sun already beginning to dip behind the mountains. The cabin was as picturesque as I had hoped. Snow blanketed the roof, icicles hung from the eaves, and the air smelled of pine. The Christmas lights were already strung along the porch, glowing softly in the dim light. The key was in the agreed-upon spot under the mat, and I stepped inside, greeted by the smell of wood and the faint, lingering scent of pine. The cabin was simple but comfortable, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a thick quilt draped over the bed. Perfect for a weekend of solitude. That first night, everything felt serene. I lit the fire, made myself some hot chocolate, and settled in with a book. Snow began to fall, lightly at first, then heavier as the hours passed. It wasn't until I got up to grab another blanket that I noticed the lights outside. They were flickering. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old lights often do that, I told myself, and they'd probably been left on by whoever managed the property. I opened the door to turn them off, but when I stepped onto the porch, I realized something strange. The lights weren't plugged in. I stared at the dangling cord, the end of it lying limp on the wooden planks of the porch. Yet the bulbs glowed, steady and bright, except for the occasional flicker. A chill ran through me, colder than the winter air. I hurried back inside, closing the door firmly behind me, and tried to shake off the unease. That night, I struggled to sleep. The storm outside had grown stronger, wind howling through the trees and rattling the windows. But it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the lights. I couldn't stop thinking about them, about the way they flickered without any apparent power source. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly to the sound of something tapping on the window. It was faint but insistent, like a branch scraping against the glass. Groggy, I got up and peered outside, expecting to see a tree branch swaying in the wind. Instead, I saw the lights. They were flickering again, but this time it wasn't random. The pattern was deliberate, a series of blinks that seemed too precise to be a coincidence. On, office, on, office. I didn't know Morse code, but I knew enough to recognize it when I saw it. The lights were blinking a message. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. Maybe someone was messing with me, a prankster or a neighbor. But that didn't make sense. The cabin was miles from anywhere, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. The tapping on the window came again, louder this time. I spun around, but when I looked, there was nothing there, just the dark outlines of trees and the falling snow. The next morning, I tried to shake off the experience. I told myself I'd been imagining things, that the isolation and the storm were playing tricks on me. But the unease lingered. While rummaging through a kitchen drawer, I found something strange, a stack of old newspaper clippings. The headlines caught my eye. Family disappears from Christmas cabin. Search called off for missing couple. Cabin in the woods linked to mysterious events. My stomach turned as I read the article. They all mentioned the same cabin, the one I was in. A family had rented it years ago for Christmas and vanished without a trace. Their belongings were left behind, the fireplace still warm, and the only clue was a string of Christmas lights that wouldn't stop flickering. I shoved the clippings back into the drawer, my hands trembling. I wanted to leave, but the snowstorm had blocked the road. I was trapped. That night, the lights flickered again, their pattern more frantic than before. The tapping on the window returned, accompanied by a faint whispering I couldn't understand. I sat by the fireplace, clutching a poker, too terrified to move. Then the lights outside went dark, plunging the porch into shadow. For a moment, I felt relief, until I realized the flickering had moved inside. The Christmas lights strung along the mantel were blinking now, their glow casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, its face obscured by a shifting veil of light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel the cold radiating from its presence. I screamed and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The cold seeped into the room, and the fire in the hearth sputtered out. I turned to face the figure, my breath visible in the freezing air. The lights blinked one final message: stay. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I managed to break a window and flee into the snow. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing in a snowbank near the main road. A passing driver found me and called for help. When I told the police what happened, they didn't believe me. They said the cabin had burned down years ago, that it was impossible for me to have stayed there. But I know what I saw. I still dream about it, and every December, when I see Christmas lights, I feel that cold, hear the tapping on the window, and wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting. It started with an old, tarnished bell, a relic I found in my late grandmother's attic just before Christmas. Her house had been empty for months, the family too busy or too heartbroken to deal with her things. But with December approaching, my mother insisted it was time to clear the place out. I volunteered, thinking it would be simple: pack some boxes, donate the rest, and be done with it. Instead, I found the bell. The attic was freezing that day, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. Dust motes floated in the pale light streaming through the cracked window as I sifted through old photo albums, Christmas decorations, and yellowed letters. That's when I saw it. The bell sat in a small wooden box tucked in the corner, its surface dull with age. It wasn't large, just the size of my palm, with an ornate handle carved to resemble twisting vines. Despite its tarnish, something about it seemed important, like it had been crafted for a purpose. I gave it a gentle shake. The sound was soft but sharp, a high-pitched chime that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should. It sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was just a bell. That night, back at my apartment, I placed the bell on my desk, planning to clean it later. It seemed like the perfect addition to my Christmas decorations, a little piece of family history. But as I sat down to wrap gifts, I thought I heard it ring. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A single echoing chime. I turned to look, expecting to see the bell tipped over, or something that could explain the noise. But it was exactly where I'd left it, motionless. I shook my head, laughing at my own jumpiness, and went back to work. That night, the dreams began. I was back in my grandmother's house, walking through the hallways, but everything was dark and cold. The air was heavy, like I was underwater, and in the distance, I could hear the bell ringing. It wasn't the pleasant chime I remembered. It was frantic, desperate, almost like a cry for help. When I woke, my chest felt tight, and my room was freezing. I glanced at the bell on my desk, its dull surface catching the dim light. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. It began small. Objects in my apartment weren't where I'd left them, Doors I'd closed were now open, and the bell would occasionally ring on its own. The sound grew louder each time, echoing in my ears even when I wasn't near it. My friends laughed when I told them about it, joking that I'd found a haunted Christmas ornament. But I wasn't laughing. The dreams became worse. Each night, I wandered deeper into my grandmother's house, following the sound of the bell. The rooms grew darker, the air colder, and I could feel something watching me. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to hear over the blood pounding in my ears. The bell was ringing again, louder this time, coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone and crept down the hallway, my fingers trembling. The lights in the living room flickered as I entered, and there it was, the bell, sitting in the middle of the coffee table. But I hadn't left it there. Before I could react, the bell rang on its own, the sound piercing and sharp. The air in the room grew icy, and I saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, its outline barely visible. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me. I froze, unable to breathe, as the figure slowly raised an arm and pointed toward the bell. The next morning, I threw the bell into a box and drove straight to my grandmother's house. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I needed answers. The house felt different now, colder, darker, as though it had been waiting for me. I went straight to the attic, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. That's when I found the journal. It was tucked in the same corner where I'd found the bell, its pages brittle with age. The entries were written in my grandmother's shaky handwriting, and as I read, my blood ran cold. She'd written about the bell, about how it had been passed down through the family for generations. According to her, the bell wasn't a decoration. It was a warning. The bell had to stay in the house, she wrote. It had to be rung every December to keep him away. Panic set in as I realized what I'd done. I'd removed the bell, taken it from the house, and now whatever it was meant to protect us from was free. The journal's last entry was the worst. If the bell stops ringing, he will come. As if on cue, I heard it. The sound of the bell, faint and distant, coming from downstairs. My heart pounded as I crept toward the sound, the journal clutched in my hands. The bell was in the living room, ringing furiously on its own. The air grew colder with each chime, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift and move. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening. A shadow emerged from the corner, its form twisting and unnatural. I froze, unable to move, as it reached for me. In a moment of sheer desperation, I grabbed the bell and rang it with all my strength. The sound cut through the air like a scream, and the shadow recoiled, retreating back into the darkness. I didn't stay long after that. I left the bell in the house, exactly where I'd found it, and never looked back. Every December, I still dream about the bell. I hear it ringing, feel the cold air, and see the shadow creeping closer. And every year I wonder, what happens if no one rings it? It was supposed to be a quiet, simple Christmas. Just me, my younger brother, Ryan, and our dad. After my parents' divorce, Dad wanted to make the holidays special, so he rented a cozy cabin in a small mountain town, the kind of place where the streets are lined with wreaths and kids build snowmen in their front yards. We arrived late in the afternoon, greeted by the smell of pine and wood smoke. The cabin was perfect, with a roaring fireplace and thick, warm blankets. But what caught Ryan's attention was the backyard. "Look!" he shouted, running to the window. There, standing in the snow, was a snowman. It was taller than most, about 7 feet high, and unusually detailed. Its face wasn't made from coal and a carrot, like you'd expect, but from smooth stones arranged into an eerily perfect smile. Its eyes were polished black, almost like real ones, and its arms were long, thin branches that ended in finger-like twigs. "Can we build one too?" Ryan asked, his face lighting up with excitement. "Maybe tomorrow," Dad said. "It's getting dark." That night, as the snow fell softly outside, I couldn't stop thinking about the snowman. Something about it unsettled me. It wasn't the size or the way it seemed too perfect. It was its posture. It didn't look like it was just standing there. It looked like it was leaning forward, almost as if it were watching the cabin. The next day, Ryan was up early, begging to play outside. Dad and I helped him build a snowman of our own, smaller and more traditional. Ryan laughed as he packed snow onto its round body, and for a moment, the unease I felt the night before melted away. When we were done, Ryan turned to look at the tall snowman in the yard. "Do you think it's lonely?" he asked. Dad chuckled. "It's just a snowman, buddy." Ryan frowned. "Then why does it keep looking at us?" I froze. "What do you mean, looking at us?" Ryan pointed at it. "It was facing the woods yesterday. Now it's facing the cabin." I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. He was right. The snowman's crooked smile was now angled directly at us. That night, I lay awake, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but it wasn't the storm that kept me up. It was the feeling that something was wrong. Around midnight, I decided to check on Ryan. His room was just down the hall, and I wanted to make sure he wasn't scared by the storm. When I opened his door, I saw his bed was empty. Panic set in as I ran through the cabin, calling his name. Dad woke up and joined me, both of us searching every room. Then we saw the back door. It was open, snow blowing in across the floor. We ran outside, calling for Ryan. The snow was deep, but we followed his footprints leading to the snowman. They stopped right in front of it, as if he'd been standing there. "Ryan!" Dad shouted, his voice cracking. That's when I saw it. Something was sticking out of the snowman's base. A small, red mitten. We dug frantically, tearing apart the snowman, but there was nothing inside. No Ryan, no sign of him, just snow. The snowman was gone by morning, its remains scattered across the yard as though it had melted overnight. But Ryan's footprints were still there, leading to where it had stood and stopping abruptly. The police were called, but there were no leads, no clues. Ryan was simply gone. A week later, back at home, I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly out the window. The snow in our front yard had turned to slush, but something caught my eye. There, standing by the curb, was a snowman. It was tall and perfectly made, with a crooked smile and black, polished eyes. And in its hand, dangling from a branch-like finger, was Ryan's red mitten. The small town of Wintervale had always been known for its Christmas traditions. Each year, the townsfolk gathered in the old church to sing carols on Christmas Eve. The choir's voices would echo through the frosty air, drawing people from miles away. It was a tradition rooted in joy and community, until last year. That year, the choir stopped singing. I was new to Wintervale at the time, having moved there just a few months earlier. I'd heard the stories about the town's Christmas spirit and was excited to experience it myself. But as the holiday approached, I noticed something strange. The townspeople didn't seem excited. They avoided the subject of Christmas Eve, and when I asked about the choir, their faces would darken. "They don't sing anymore," my neighbor Mrs. Thatcher told me, her voice low. "Not since what happened." When I pressed her for details, she shook her head. "Best not to speak of it. Just stay inside that night. Lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't listen if you hear them." I laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but the look in her eyes told me otherwise. On Christmas Eve, the town felt deserted. Most houses had their curtains drawn, and the streets were eerily silent. I tried to shake off the strange feeling, telling myself it was just a small-town quirk. But as the night wore on, unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound. Singing. It was faint at first, drifting through the cold night air like a whisper. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, each note clear and perfect, yet something about it felt wrong. I got out of bed and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the street. It was empty, but the singing grew louder, echoing as though it came from everywhere at once. Against my better judgment, I opened the front door. The cold hit me like a slap, but I stepped outside, drawn by the music. The sound was coming from the church at the end of the street. Its tall steeple loomed against the night sky, and the stained glass windows glowed faintly. I knew I shouldn't go, but curiosity got the better of me. As I approached, the singing grew louder, and I could make out the words. They weren't the usual carols. No Silent Night, or O Holy Night. These were strange, unfamiliar verses, sung in a language I didn't recognize. The church doors were slightly ajar, and the light from inside spilled onto the snow. I pushed them open and stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The pews were filled with people, their faces turned toward the altar. They weren't moving, just sitting there, singing in perfect harmony. And they were wrong. Their mouths were moving, but their faces were pale, frozen in expressions of terror. Their eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead, and frost clung to their hair and clothes. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but my foot caught on something, and I nearly fell. Looking down, I saw a pair of shoes, small, child-sized shoes. They were attached to a child, lying in the aisle, her body stiff and cold. Her lips were blue, her face frozen in an expression of fear. Panic set in as I realized there were others. Bodies were scattered throughout the church, hidden among the pews and beneath the choir loft. Each one was frozen, their faces locked in the same look of terror. And still, the singing continued. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The singing grew louder, deafening, and I felt a cold hand grip my arm. I spun around, and one of the singers was standing in front of me. Up close, I could see frost creeping up their neck, their breath coming in puffs of white vapor. Their lips moved, forming words I couldn't understand, but their eyes begged for help. Somehow, I broke free and ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty church. I didn't stop until I was back in my house, the door locked and bolted. The singing followed me, growing fainter as the night wore on, until it finally stopped at dawn. The next morning, the church was empty. The bodies were gone, and the townspeople refused to talk about what happened. When I tried to bring it up, they just shook their heads and told me to leave it alone. I moved away from Wintervale after that, but every Christmas Eve, I hear them, the silent choir. Their voices echo through the night, haunting and beautiful, calling out to anyone who dares to listen. The next morning, the church was empty. The bodies were gone, and the townspeople refused to talk about what happened. When I tried to bring it up, they just shook their heads and told me to leave it alone. I moved away from Wintervale after that, but every Christmas Eve, I hear them, the silent choir. Their voices echo through the night, haunting and beautiful, calling out to anyone who dares to listen. The silent choir's haunting melody stays with me every Christmas Eve. No matter where I am, I hear it. A faint, eerie song drifting through the night air. I've tried everything to block it out. Earplugs, blasting music, even leaving town during the holidays. Nothing works. Last year, I made the mistake of listening too closely. The song was louder than ever, and for a moment, I let myself get lost in its beauty. I almost opened the door, almost stepped outside, but I stopped when I saw them. Through the frosted window, I saw their figures standing in the snow, dozens of them, faces pale, eyes wide, lips moving in silent unison. They didn't knock or try to enter. They just stood there, singing, their frozen forms illuminated by the pale moonlight. This year, I know they'll come again. They always do. I don't know how much longer I can resist. The music is getting louder, more insistent, and every time I hear it, it's like it's calling my name. One day, I fear I'll answer, and when I do, I'll join them. The silent choir is always looking for new voices.